doing Simkuf Chaf Halacha Dal today. Shrapadish, in English called a tripod. It's the grate, the stovetop grate. In stovetop grate. It's what's called a dry fuss. That's what the Tazan Shach calls a dry fuss. That's in 3 feet. Okay. Shishayis and Lane Baktera. That you put the pots on top of it. So it's a stovetop grate. In Tunis field, they don't need to be Tevillas. Avo Tevillas, that's a spit. The Beis calls it a grillish, like as in like the word grill, and others call it a roast. Okay, a roast. Again, yeah, it's a grill, a spit. Tunis Tevillas, and the reason why that one needs Tevillas nation, because you put the food right onto it. Okay, so what's it been saying? It appears to be saying is that the things that touch food, that's why it's called food contact, things that touch food, those things need tevilah. So the spit, you put your food right onto it, as opposed to the grate, the stovetop grate does touch the food. You only put your pots on top, you don't put your food onto that. So that doesn't need tevilah. So this thing, at first glance, there's no Gemara that says this thing. It's not brought in the Torah either. The Beis brings it. It's Rishonim who speak about it. But there's no Gemara. Okay, so what's the makar that there's such a rule that if it doesn't touch the food, I need it for later. That if it doesn't touch the food, that it doesn't need to. So the Gemara says that when the Gemara does say, which is what we'll talk about in the next halacha, the Gemara says a line, Klei Seudah Murim Parsha. That's what the Gemara says, Klei Seudah Murim Parsha. And that means the Gemara said in a different thing, that has to do with food, things that you use for preparing food. Meaning, if you use a scissors for cutting paper, you don't have to title that because it's not made for using for food. And the Gemara uses that line to describe Klei Seudah Murim Parsha, only things that you use for preparing food. But the Rashba says really the makar even to that means not things for cutting paper don't need tevilah. The makar to that is because the parsha of Tevillas Keilim and the parsha of Hagolas Keilim are intertwined. They're all mixed together. The psukim are all mixed one with the other. So it's to teach you that it's the Keilim that need Hagolas Keilim are the Keilim that need Tevillas Keilim. They go together. That's why the parshas are together like that. So it's only the things that are Klei Seudah, which are potentially need Hagolas Keilim, those are the things that need Tevillas Keilim. And so just like it teaches us that din, which is the din coming the next din, that if you have a scissors for cutting paper, you don't need tevilah. So too it teaches us this din, that only the things that touch the food need tevilah. It doesn't say it in the Gemara. The Gemara says that Gemara, the makar to that Gemara is the makar to our din. Also, the thing that you put food that touch the food, those things need tevilah. But the things that touch
paper, scissors also need tevilah.
Because
you use it to cut a knife and then
No. If you have a scissor that's only used for cutting paper, like the Mora uses it in kindergarten, she just uses it for cutting paper. So what does it need? It doesn't need tears. It doesn't have a close scale. And the B'ton Sheva cuts paper.
Well, okay, if you're going to use it, you want to use it for cutting.
No, it's a scissor for cutting papers. Well, you never cut tray with it. You cut papers with it.
I understand. Well, you want to cut papers.
It's a scissor. If they keep it in the kindergarten, they cut for papers. You never have to cut.
Because there's no blears.
Right. So
they're meant for chicken also.
So it teaches us the types of things that need tevilah, the types of things that get traced from touching food, things that are not meant for cutting food, things that are that's sold for not for food use, they don't need to. So now, just regular. If you hold 1 second, maybe I'll help answer your question.
The part says the makar of the tumah that you have to be entitled for.
Okay.
Is that the keilim is muchan for machalas asuras. It's muchan.
Okay.
It's used for.
Okay. So that's actually a question. That's actually a question we'll get to in a later din, I think, about what happens if the guy didn't use it for food and I do use it for food. That's a question. We'll hold that a second. You're saying because the guy had in mind to use it for food, puts on a certain tumah to it. Let's say he used it for paper and I'm going to use it for food. It's going to be in a later din. Okay. So you're connecting it to the fact that how did the guy plan on using it? It may not depend on it. Okay. So the even though that's the course that's the makar to the din, it's not the rules of the din. So what I mean is like this. The rule is that it's only things that need to have hagolas keilim. The thought is things that need hagolas keilim need tevilas keilim. But that doesn't mean that, let's say I use something for cold, okay, and I don't need to do hagolas keilim to it. Okay? So we don't say, no, it doesn't need Tevillas Keilim. It's going to be a later din. If you use a cup just for cold, it needs Tevillas Keilim anyhow. What are they using? A brand new Keilim. It needs Tevillas Keilim also. It's not the way we the rules of the din, but it teaches us the criteria, the types of things that have food contact in our case, or that are used for food. That's the next din. Those are the kinds of things that need to have Tevillas Keilim. But once you got past that, you don't follow the rules of whether there are or not beliefs. Okay. So the simple cases, what I just said to you, like the cold food, if you use a cup that you don't use for cold, that doesn't mean you have Tevillas Keilim. You don't have to Kashrus, you just have to get rid of the tray. So then you still need to do Tevillas Keilim. Okay. But the opposite l'chayr is also true. Okay. This is my first of my toys. Okay, and that is like this. When you have this is called a chafing dish, and what you have is you have a little fire on the bottom. Okay, and in here there's a big pan that holds water. Okay, you put water into here, and then you put food into the top pan. The food pan goes on top of that. Okay, the bottom is a water pan, and then comes a food pan on top of it. So, of course, the top pan, assuming these were all needed tefillah, assuming that they were real and they needed tefillah. So the top one, of course, needs tefillah. You put your food into it. Okay, what about the bottom one? Okay, this bottom one over here has no contact with food. It's just a way of heating up water. Heating up water to heat your food eventually. So, this thing, if you look at our din, as we stand now, we'll see more as we go on. As we stand now, the bottom one shouldn't need tefillah, doesn't touch the food. But does it have blias? Does the bottom one have blias? Of course it has blias. Because there's food sitting in here, there's loads of moisture and water passing back and forth. Of course there are blias into the bottom one. The Indian hakolos can we kasher these bottom ones because they become treif or fleishids from the top food. But with Indian Tevillas Keilim, it doesn't touch the food, so it doesn't have to be titled. Okay? So here it's the opposite. Here the taka has a blia, but even though it has a blia, we would say no. But the rule is Klei Seudah when parsha. What the rule became, what touches food, the bottom will never touch the food.
Regular for the bottom Keilim. Your maggid could happens to be it's going to top it up.
No, but it became straight. This thing becomes. I'm saying it's a thing with blias coming. It's in the parsha of Hagolos Keilim because it becomes straight. But even though it becomes straight, we don't have to title any out. That's my point. Okay, it is a thing that gets blias in it, but we don't care because this is like sort of what you're saying. If my floor becomes straight, I don't have to title my floor. It's straight, so it has nothing to do with it. Doesn't mean I have to title. Okay.
So water is considered food?
No, it is a food, but it's not being used as a food. Here it's using it as a heating media. What do you mean theoretically?
You have a boiler, he could drink it, let's say. It's drinkable.
Right. Klei Seudah means is that it's used in making food for, as another tip, I forgot to mention that. In fact, Yeshua brings a shita, which he says no one agrees with, but he brings such a shita that says that the pot that you heat up water for washing your dishes, you wash the dishes in a basin, that basin that you wash dishes in, you have to title it. And he says, what are you talking about? It doesn't touch food. And what those people are thinking is, Lamaisa is, that has blias, that's used with you stick your dirty dishes into it and there's potentially blias in there, so they'll look at it like very, very exact, that if it has blias, then you have to title it, and everybody else says, no, it's not like that. The rule is not just because it has a blia in it. Lamaisa says it doesn't have any contact with food, you don't eat out of that thing, it's just for washing dishes, so you don't need to title. Okay. So that's a simple case. We'll get back to this shaking dish in a second. Okay, now, so therefore, let's move it a step further. What happens if I have a blech, and I never put food on my blech, or I have a rack in my oven that I never put food on, or I have a serving tray, I have things like this. That if I'm a kind of person who never puts food onto those things, so then I don't have to title it. Okay, we're going to see in a later din that what happens if you once in a while put food onto it? Ignore that for now. But assuming I'm a person who never puts food onto that thing, I don't plan to put food onto it, so then I'm not going to need to title it. It doesn't need to feel it because it doesn't have, that's our thing, it doesn't have food content. Okay. What happens if I have a thing, that's why I put this bowl. Okay, pretend that this was a glass bowl, okay? I have something, pretend this is a glass bowl, okay? Okay, I have something that I use for food, okay, but the food never touches it. Like in this case, okay, this bowl, the candy that's sitting in this bowl were always wrapped candies. Okay, what if I have a cake tray, and they always put a doily down before I put the cake into it. So I never touch the cake onto the tray. What happens if I have a rack in my toaster, and I always put everything with foil on it first? Okay, so I use it all the time for food, but I never put food directly onto it. Like in this case, this bowl's been sitting in the waiting room for 1,000 years. Okay? It's never touched food. It always has candies that are wrapped up. Okay, so does this thing need or not need to? So, Shulchan says, and Rabbi Yashiv said that yes, it does, because in all those cases that I just described to you, I don't know if they say every one of those cases, in all those cases, the little bit of, in this case, the paper, or the foil, or the doily, is tuffle to the food, and it's considered that this is a kli that's holding food. Okay? This is Klei Seudah. This is holding the food. The fact that there's a little piece of paper wrapped of candy, that's tafel and doesn't count. Okay? So be'etzem, this is considered that this is touching the food. Rav Shachta said the same thing, came to the same conclusion, but he had a different way of being masbrit, and then we'll hear the nafkaminas between these ways of explaining. He said like this. He said, the reason why this is chayim tefillah is not because the paper is tafel to the candy. That's not the reason. He says the criteria we're looking for, the criteria we're looking for is not whether it touches the food. That's what it says in the din. It's that what touches the food. But the real nafkamina is it Klei Seudah or not? So what we care about is, does the kli service the food or not? In this case, what does this kli do? This is a bowl that holds candies. So the paper there is unimportant. It's sort of like the paper is tafel to the bowl. The bowl is servicing the food. If I have a cake tray and I always put something underneath it, it's a cake tray. It services the cake. When I have a stovetop grate, that's not servicing food. That holds up pots. That's what it does. It holds up the pot. So that's why it doesn't need tevilah. But in this one, the reason, it's not that the paper is tafel to the candy. It's that the bowl is servicing food. What the rule here is not touching. Doesn't say sort of. It's a question whether it says touching or not. The criteria is not touching. The criteria is, like the Gemara says in the Gemara says, it's Klei Seudah Murim B'Parsha. Is this a Klei Seudah? Is this thing that is used for food? Yeah, this bowl services food. It holds a dozen candies. And therefore it needs tevilah. Okay? That's how he understands why these kind of things need tevilah. Okay? The nafkamina between them is, a few nafkaminas. So one of them is, if you have there's a machine for warming up baby bottles. Okay, so ignore the fact that it's electric. Make the assumption that even though it's electric, it needs to have tevilah in it. You take a baby bottle filled with milk, you stick it into this little machine, and it warms up the milk. So that milk, there's no contact, has no food contact. So the earlier people I mentioned to you who said, you could say that in this case the wrapper is tafel to the food. Then I could say it's tafel. Of course not. The baby bottle is not tafel to the milk. Okay, you wouldn't say that is tafel, and they would say you don't have to tevilah. Which is what most people assume, you don't have to tevilah. But Rav Shachta said, no, you do have to tevilah. Because what's this bottle warmer doing? It's not warming up bottles, it's warming up milk. It's servicing the milk just like this bowl services the candy. That's what it's there for. Okay? It's not like a grate where the stovetop grate is just holding up pots. This is not holding up pots, this is warming up the milk. So he said, in that case, just like in our din, if it services the food, it's chayv and tevilah. Klei Seudah, this is a Klei Seudah that warms up milk, so the baby can eat it. So he said that would be chayv and tevilah. So no, because the tripod holds up pots. That's all it does.
But servicing the food, you're not just...
No. Yeah, of course, indirectly, of course, it services the food. Well, you're in the kitchen.
When you put the chicken, when you want to put the chicken in the oven, you put the pot that has the chicken in the oven, then put the chicken in the oven for shame it's in the pot.
Okay. So
that's... One second. I think you kind of is right, move by an oven.
Because?
An oven should kind of feel under a check.
The oven is... I'm coming to the oven in a second. Regular. We're not really talking about... I'm going to talk about something similar to that. Regular. Just pause for that question. Okay? But that's under the pot.
It's under the pot. But the oven is making the food.
Okay, get to the oven. Regular for the oven. Okay, regular. Okay, so, but also, what would you say now back to our shaking dish? Okay, what does Rav Shachta say about the shaking dish? I told you the bottom one has no food contact. It's just heating up the water. It doesn't have any contact with the food. Okay, sure, that's no food contact. Okay, this container is not tafel because this is more serious. This is not going to be tafel. But the water that's in there, is this pot servicing the food? You could argue that the pot on the bottom, the water pot actually is servicing the food. What is it doing? The thing on the bottom, it's
holding the water. That was spilled.
What do you say?
It's holding the water. It shouldn't spill.
It's holding the water. You could argue that bottom one is actually servicing the food. Okay,
it's holding the water.
It's holding.
I wasn't going to this in a tripod.
You want the water to heat up the food.
I'm not talking about the frame. I'm talking about this pot over here. This thing has water in it. What is this doing?
This be done on a tripod. They're both holding up the...
No, this is not holding up the pot. The frame holds up the pot. This thing is making hot water to make my food hot. It's a fancy way to do it, so I don't have to mush the water into it. It's a fancy way to do it. But the water is heating up my food. So this whole pan is to heat up food. It's a fancy way to heat up food. If the tripod is there just to hold the pot, I can't put the pot right into the fire, so I hold it up a little bit. But this thing this is sort of what it's doing. It's not.
The fire under the tripod. The tripod is there to hold the...
Right, it's to separate them. But over here, there's a fire here. The pan here is a way to make the the food get heated up. Okay, we could argue that. Okay. Let's go on. Next. Even the way I'm telling you, Rabbi Shachar would say, we would assume, this was the next type of food, that a nutcracker wouldn't need tefillah. Why? Because the nutcracker, it's not servicing the food. A nutcracker or a can opener, they remove an outer layer. Okay, their job is to get something out. That's not supposed to be there. The shell or the can. But they have nothing to do with the food. They don't make the food any better or do anything for the food. They just remove the thing that's blocking me from getting my food. It takes away the shell, or the can opener takes away the can. Okay, so even Rabbi Shechter's way, we should say that as we stand now, shouldn't need to. Okay, and the family of Rabbi Moshe quote from him as saying that nutcrackers don't need tefillah, and we understand that why they shouldn't need tefillah. Rav Vosson also says that he a little bit at the end takes it back and says maybe you should tefillah that bracha. Rav Vosson says he says well, my is all you do with a nutcracker. At least he says usually even when you use a nutcracker, you crack the nut, and then the actual getting the food out of the nut you do by hand. He says so. His mom said he never touches the food, so he says Pasha says he shouldn't need tefillah. At the end he says maybe you should do without a bracha. Okay, but he says those are the understandable shitas that we say is that the thing shouldn't need. The simpler shita that says is it doesn't need tefillah because it doesn't touch any food. Okay, it's only touching shells or it's touching the can. Okay, so Rosh Hashanah says no. He says no, it needs tefillah with a bracha, no less.
What?
Nutcracker. I'll get can opener is going to be next. For now, nutcracker. He says it needs tefillah, and he says this. If I was more prepared, I would have put it up on the screen for you. He says like this. He says kivan sherigilu lohavi had goyzam achas shulchan pa'odim b'kli pasuk. You bring the nuts to the table when you're even with the shells on. He doesn't mean to a table. It means you eat them. Bring them to eat even with the shells on. Harizet gufamaychel. So what he's saying is that the way I understand it is, the Gra told us the criteria here is not whether it touches the food. Touching the food is the usual way we judge it. The criteria here is a Klei Seudah. That means is when you sit down to eat, when you want to eat nuts. What do? When you want to eat nuts, you take out a nutcracker and you start eating the nuts. It's not like a factory's machine that prepares it, like away from when you're eating. When you're ready to eat, you take out the nutcracker, you break the nuts, and then you eat them. So the shell, from this perspective, the shell is like the shell is like the food itself. Because touching food is not important. The essence is not important if it touches food. What's important is it the kind of thing that you take when you're ready to eat? Is that how you get the food ready? Okay, so from that side, it's Klei Seudah. Okay, now. Ravelsky once told me, I don't remember what he says, I only have notes, we're going to have to conjecture what he said. He told me that he thinks that they need tefillah. He told me that a nutcracker needs tefillah. And he just said the way all my notes say, so I don't remember it, I don't see what it says. They prepare the food for eating. Okay? They prepare the food for eating. I'm not exactly sure what that meant when he said that, when I wrote that he prepares the food for eating. I wondered if what he meant was that, in Hilchos Shabbos is a discussion about borer when you're separating the shell from the nuts, okay? I'm not saying that it is borer, but there's a whole discussion about when it is or is not borer to separate the shell from the nuts. So it could be that the nutcracker, what it does is it helps you, we look at the whole thing as the shell is not oichel, but separating the shell from the oichel is a way of making, is considered food preparation also. Again, not food contact, but food preparation also. Okay. If you guys are patient, we'll keep on. Okay. Now we move to a can opener. Okay. So can opener has none of the advantages that I just mentioned to you about a nutcracker. You don't bring can openers to the table. You don't use it for preparing the food. The can opener and the food are not intertwined that we should maybe look at them as one big piece of food. Okay, so can opener seems more simple that the can opener shouldn't need to. But there's a possibility why you may think it does. Okay, I don't think it's correct, but there's a possibility why you might think that the can opener needs to feel it, and that is, we're going to see in a later day. If I have a Klei, I mentioned to you as scissors. Okay, if I have a scissors I use for cutting paper, and I decide one time I want to use it for food. I have some other Klei that I use, usually not for food, but once in a while I decide to use it for food. So the Ramah says you have to type that. Okay, we're going to talk about over there whether that's the truth, whether we actually postulate that or not. But for now, we'll make the assumption that if you use it once in a while for food, it's chayav in tefillah. Okay, let's work with that assumption. That's chayav in tefillah.
So I use it once.
That's a question over there. We're going to get to that in exactly how many times.
Maybe use the scissors one time.
Right, so that's a question over there. But let's work the assumption now that if you choose to use it even one time or even sometimes, you're Chayav and Tefillah. Okay, it's going to be a halacha chesed. For now, just take my word. There's such a possibility that it's Chayav and Tefillah. What happens, but if you have a food, you have something like a can opener, that of course you never use it for food, but there's unintentional contact with the food. Which is to say, when you finish opening up a can, often enough, there's food on your can. It means the can pokes into your food and it touches the food. So when you say that this has food contact, I don't mean all the time, but it has occasional food contact, and if occasional is enough, so should we say that this counts, that this is considered that this has food contact? Or what you say is that it's always unintentional. You're not trying to get the can opener into the food. The fact that it touches the food it just happens sort of by mistake. So should that count as considered to be it has food contact or doesn't have food contact? Okay, so at first there should be an obvious raya from our din. Okay, it says, and I think it is a good raya. It says the tripod doesn't need to have tefillah. Okay, the tripod is the grate, and the pot sits on top of it. Okay, well tripods get dirty. Food spills onto them. Okay. Well, so that's a reason to think that it's not true. Okay, I'm going to say that in 1 second. Okay, I'll say what David said. David saying like this. He says is, even though it touches the food, okay, in Indian Hakol is Keilim, we have such a din that to talk about what should you do about that thing on the mat doesn't need to be kashrus, right? But that food is always going in the garbage. Okay, so what you mean to say is like this. That the criteria here is not whether it touches food. The criteria is it Klei Seudah or not? Well, it's not Klei Seudah, because the food that touches there goes, no one eats that food. Okay, so that's a reason to argue this. Okay, but I thought at first maybe it was right. I'm not convinced. No, I think David is more right, that it's not right. Okay, another possible right. There's a din later on, if a person buys a knife, and he's not going to use it for food. He buys it from a guy, and he's not going to use it for food. So it's not Chayav and Tefillah. It's not Chayav and Tefillah. It's a knife for, I don't know what, for doing something else, for cutting something else. He's not a box cutter, not Chayav and Tefillah. Then he lent it to another yid, and the other yid decides he wants to use it for food. Okay? So I lend it to you for a week, and you use it for food. So the Mechaber says, there's no chiv of tefillah in that case. Even though the other person decides to use it for food, there's no chiv in tefillah. We'll see when we get to that din that there's a Taz and Shach who maybe argue for like a side reason. But the Mechaber says you're not chayiv in tefillah in that case. So why not chayiv in tefillah? How can they say the reason why not chayiv in tefillah is because you're not the owner? How are you to decide that it should not be used? Well, is that worse than unintentional use? Is that you said if you, the not owner, did it, so you can't decide what the status of the kli is? Is that worse than unintentional use? Horror, that's unintentional, just like other things are. Okay, we'll see another right in a minute. But my is it seems that it's correct that unintentional use doesn't count. Rebelsky said that came up for his own, or before said that also, and others normally assume that came up does not need to. Okay, so now we're going to move on to like this. Another thing that we have to sort of separate, but it's connected to our thing, and that is like this. In the Shulchan Aruch, printed in Halacha Hey, the Rama says the following thing. Okay, he says the Chen Kisui Shekayfen al Hapas La'afoyser, a cover that you put on top of bread to bake the bread, doesn't need tefillah. Avo kisu kidei tzarich tefillah. The cover you put on the pot needs tefillah. Okay, now the way the Rama writes v'chein, and the whole thing that he's talking about, I'll explain to you what it means in a second, leads the Chavdas Piyam to say is that Rama really belongs in our din. Okay, the place for that din is not Halacha Hey. That's what I'm talking about today. That Rama does not belong in Halacha Hey. It belongs in Halacha Dalet. The v'chein means is the cover that you put onto when you bake bread, like you put some kind of a cover on the top of it, doesn't need tefillah because it never touches the bread. You have the bread baking over there, and the cover that goes on top of it never touches the bread. Okay, so the cover never touches the bread, then it doesn't need to be tefillah. Okay, so before I tell you about the pot, just pause for a second. You should just know that there's a Magen Avram in Pesach who talks about that the cover actually does touch the bread. The cover sometimes does touch the bread. And he talks about leaning the Hagolah of it. How do you kasher that cover because it occasionally touches the bread? Not to get to us right now what he talks about there, but the fact is that it does occasionally touch the bread. It's another raya that unintentionally touching it doesn't make it chayav to you. Okay? Well, we talked about a second. Okay, so the cover of the bread doesn't touch the bread. It's not chayav to you. So what's with the cover of the pot? Why is the cover of the pot different? The difference is that in a pot, when you cook up something in a pot or you fry something in a pot, there's a lot of vapor comes out of the top of it. Yesterday when David and I kashed something, you can see loads and loads of vapor coming out of it, to the point that in in Bliyas, in Hagal's Keilim, we look at it, that liquid is so thick, it's called Hevel HaGeter, it's so thick that it's as if it touches the food itself. It's not Iru, it has to do with how you kash that Klei. And that's considered to be direct contact with the food, and therefore the cover of the pot is touching the food. It's not touching the regular part of the food. It's touching this thick cloud that comes on top of the food, and that's considered as if it's touching the food. Okay? So the reason why the cover of a pot or of a frying pot needs to be titled is because all that vapor that gets trapped underneath it is as if it's food itself, and therefore it needs to be sealed to touch the food. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you some details about covers. Okay, and some questions about covers, but seemingly, this din is not like what Rabbi Shechta said. And the reason why it's not like him is because the cover that you put on the bread. Why do you put a cover on the bread? According to Rabbi Shechta, touching is not important. So what's really the difference between putting a cover on a pot or putting a cover on a bread? Both of them make the food cook better. That's why you do it. It must be. It's there for cooking the food, so it's not for decoration. So you're putting it on to cook the food. So what's the difference whether it covers liquid or covers solid? This difference that I told you, that if one has this thick cloud and one doesn't, make no difference, Rabbi Shechta. He doesn't care if it touches. All he cares about is whether is it servicing the food. So l'chayra, over here the cover is of the bread is also servicing the food. Why is it any different if it serves the food by a liquid or a solid? Both of them are helping the food. So that din, which is the Ramah, and the next din, seem not like Rabbi Shechta. I'll only tell you that even though that's what it seems like, and that's the pshat in the din, Rabbi Yasher says something which is very similar to Rabbi Shechta said, and that was like this. Rabbi Yasher said that if you have the cover on a container that keeps the food from losing something that it has, in the case that they're bringing from is, it keeps the carbon dioxide from getting out of your soda. Okay, so then it keeps something from getting out. That's considered to be that it's a part of the Klei and needs to be titled. If it keeps something getting from the outside, like from bacteria to getting in and spoiling it, that's not Klei Seudah. It's along the lines of Aruch. Okay, I'll pass on that. But for now, and you should know there's an Aruch who is a different shot in this Ramah. Of course, Aruch is a shot in Ramah. The Aruch says a different shot in this din, which would be maybe different shot in Ramah, and maybe that's what they hold like. But seemingly, this Ramah is not like the Rabbi Shechta said. Okay. Another cover is, why don't you have a cover on a barbecue? Okay? You have a cover on a barbecue. When you make a barbecue, you put your food out, you put it on fire, and there's a cover that comes down on top of it. Okay, now, if we're thinking about whether we have to title, if you have to title that cover, seemingly that cover is similar to the cover on bread, not like the cover on liquids. Because when you're making a barbecue, there's not this tremendous amount of vapors. I mean, how much vapor builds up underneath it? Maybe David will tell us better. How much vapor builds up? It's more along the lines of a bread cover than a pot cover. In a pot cover, there's all the water boiling that's filling up the whole thing and making havoc there. In a barbecue, the hot dogs and potatoes and whatever you put into there are not in so much vapor to make that status. So we would think that the cover of a barbecue should need to be titled. But think about now how Rabbi Shechta would think about it. How would he say, did that need to be titled or not? What's the reason why there's a cover on a barbecue? The cover on the barbecue is because it keeps the heat inside of it. Okay, the cover on a bread doesn't keep the heat in because the bread's baking in an oven. When you bake bread in an oven, the whole oven chamber keeps the heat in. So the bread cover is just doing this little bit, whatever it's doing something to help the cooking. But in a barbecue, the cover of the barbecue is what keeps the heat in and very much assists in the baking of it, much more similar even to the cover of a pot. So according to him, you would have to title that cover of a barbecue. Now, maybe he would think that. Maybe that's the truth. He thinks you have to cover the the cover of a barbecue. We would think not. It doesn't touch the food. It doesn't even touch any hevel because there's no hevel in the barbecue. You wouldn't have to cover the cover. Title the cover. He seemingly would say you have to. But what's more surprising, if I could use the word, to us would be is, then l'chayri he should say you should have to title the chamber of a toaster also. Because the chamber of a toaster also does the same function. It never touches the food. I'm not talking about the grate. The chamber of the toaster. Okay, it never touches the food. So for us, we say, of course you don't have to title. What we're looking for is does it touch the food? It doesn't touch the food. So we normally say it doesn't touch the food. You don't have to title it. But he says does it help in the cooking of the food? Of course it helps in the cooking. Because if not for that chamber, your food would never cook. Because in a big open space, it would cook in 1,000 years. So you need the chamber to keep all the heat in.
It's not just the grill, it's the whole grill.
Right, yeah, I don't mean just to cover everything, the whole thing. Now, when we get to an oven, which is what you said, we're going to talk about ovens later. Okay, there are other reasons why I might not need to tevel an oven. I'm focusing on a toaster. The toaster loses a lot of those reasons why you wouldn't have to tevel an oven. Okay, so oven itself, put on the side for now. But a toaster oven is more the question, which is the whole chamber functions for the food. It's all there to help keep the heat in and make the food cook. So seemingly, according to Rabbi Sheffer, I don't ever ask him that question, and I don't think he would tell someone to tevel that chamber. But we have a hard time understanding why wouldn't you? Okay? One last thing that has to do with the cover has nothing to do with what we've been talking about today about touching the food, and that is like this. I told you, I think it was last time. The Rabbi Yashiv says that if a person does tefillah on a pot with a cover, the bracha that he makes is a tefillas Klei, not a tefillas Keilim. And he says, you say a tefillas Klei because it's one Klei, the cover on the pot is one Klei. And actually, that may be have a makorta in the Urzaru that I didn't mention to you before. Putaka says like that. Maybe the makorta is like that. He said he makes bracha al tefillas Klei. That's one thing, one rule. Okay. Klei is singular, and Keilim is plural. Yeah. You say al tefillas Klei instead of al tefillas Keilim.
What did you say? Keilim?
Keilim, al tefillas Keilim. Chof lamed yud. You pronounce it however you like to. Okay. So you can pronounce it how you like to. Okay. So now that. Don't worry about the dip now. Okay, that's one thing. The second thing, there's another din. That is that when you do tefillas, let's say you have a Klei that's made half out of metal and half out of wood. I don't mean it's a mixture. Let's say it's a spoon, and the handle is wood, and the spooning part of it is metal. So the metal needs tefillah, so to speak, and the wood wouldn't be mechayim in tefillah. Wood doesn't need tefillah. But the din is when you tevel this spoon, you have to tevel the wood also. You don't just tevel the metal part of it, you tevel the wood, the whole thing, the whole Klei has to undergo tefillah simultaneously. Okay? So, Rabbi first says, let's put these two things together. On the one hand, we say a cover and a pot are considered one Klei. Okay? On the other hand, another thing we have is that you have to tevel the whole Klei. You treat the whole Klei at once, even if part of it is not chayiv in tefillah. So that means what happens if I have a crock pot? And the cover of my crock pot is glass, and the base of my crock pot is ceramic, as many of them are. The base is ceramic. So the ceramic doesn't need tefillah, wouldn't demand tefillah because of the ceramic, but the cover is glass and does demand tefillah. So he says the cover needs tefillah. Rabbi Yashiv says the cover and the pot are considered one. So when I tevel the cover, I have to tevel the pot with it. The pot itself wouldn't be something that would be chayiv in tefillah. The etzem wouldn't be chayiv because it's made out of cheres. But since it's one with the cover, so then the cover, it should be sort of dragged along with the cover, just like the cover needs tefillah. The pot does, the base does, the bowl does also. Just like we say, I told by a spoon. If half of it was what it would need, if it's one big Klei, you have to tevel the whole thing. So you should tevel the whole thing also.
I understand now because you can't use a crock pot on the top. Is that the same thing as being one Klei, or is it different?
Same, a variation of the same thing. Okay, it's a variation of the same thing. He considers it to be one big Klei. He told me it comes from Rabbi Yashiv. Rabbi Yashiv said you make bracha al tefillas Klei, now al tefillas Keilim. It's one big Klei. So now it's not so clear. I mean, did Rabbi Yashiv mean, like David said, did he really mean that you have to tevel it once, like the whole Klei, dunk it in together, the cover and the pot together? Is that really what he meant? Did he mamash mean it's one Klei, that one part can make the other part be chayiv in tefillah? It's not so clear. I mean, is that for real? So this thing that refers to saying that you should tevel the ceramic bases, I don't know anybody else who says like that. And the question is whether when he's quoting this part, Rabbi Yashiv didn't say to tevel the base. I don't know if anybody else in that question, but he didn't say that part of it. Rabbi first is putting these pieces together to say that therefore you have to tevel the base. Most people do not do that. Okay, so let me just show you just a summary. Okay, that's what we have here for a slide.
Most people do tevel the covers.
They do tevel the cover because it's glass and it's a cover on a pot. The cover on a pot, the Rama says a cover on a pot, you have to tevel. Even though it doesn't touch the food per se, it touches the vapor that's underneath it. You have to tevel. So you cover most people tevel the glass and not the bottom. We're first tells people not to. Okay, anyhow, just 3 slides here, items that we talked about. Of a crock pot that has a glass cover and a ceramic pot. Almost everybody tells the glass on top. Rabbi first says to tevel the bowl part of it. So he says,
and he doesn't do it at the same time?
No, I don't know if he tells people to do that. But if you're thinking that that's the problem, maybe you shouldn't.
It could be chatzitza. If you don't need to do it together, you stick it together.
That's worse. You're right. Okay, we can answer those questions. Okay.
Put in the mikvah and then put the cover on.
What's what is filled inside of it? You say? Okay. Anyhow, here's a list of things. come out every one of these we talked about. This 3 lists. You'll see. This is the first one. I don't know if you have finished. You guys read. There are some things on here that we may not have said here. I said cork screw doesn't need to is on the list that we didn't speak about. Okay. I assume in this. Hope I got my colors right. I assume this is not like the very first. Okay. Anything else that we didn't talk about? A microwave plate, knife sharpener, egg slicer. So some pet fruit dish. I didn't see anybody speak about that. A pet food dish. Well, it's not Klei Seudah, right? I mean, the pets don't count, so I assume it doesn't need to. And anything else that we didn't talk about here? No. Spoon rest. Okay, spoon rest. I sort of first mentioned that. A spoon rest means you put your spoon on the counter. You don't eat off it. It's not a good trade. Okay, Shader.